Okay, welcome everybody to History of Women in the Senate. I am Sheila Budoff with Arlington County 55 Plus program. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the Arlington County 55 Plus YouTube channel at a later date as time permits. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that she will be the only one appearing in the recording. Many thanks to Ashley Gomez Figueredo, Director of the Lubber Run 55 Plus Center, for hosting this program at the center and making it possible for us to offer it in a hybrid format and make it more accessible. You are viewing this program through the Virtual Center for Active Adults, VCAA platform. VCAA is a partnership of Northern Virginia jurisdictions that provide free virtual programming for older adults and adults with disabilities in our area. Okay, and then this brings me to the best part of our program. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce Kate Scott, our guest speaker for today. Kate Scott has been a historian with the U.S. Senate Historical Office for close to 15 years. She is the Senate historian. So I am truly, as I said, very honored and delighted that she would take time out from her busy schedule to join us and share this program with us. She holds a PhD in history from Temple University. She has taught as a visiting lecturer at Cornell University and Carroll University in Wisconsin. Her scholarly research interests have focused on U.S. politics, women in politics, and 20th century social movements. Dr. Scott has extensive publications in the field, including a book, articles, and book chapters. We're going to leave time at the end for Q&A. Those of you at home are welcome to enter your questions in the chat as we go along. When we get to the Q&A, I'm happy to read them out loud and facilitate Q&A. You're also welcome to unmute yourselves and ask your questions or use Zoom's raise hand function. And for people at Lubber Run, I'm just admitting people at Lubber Run, Ashley, you can ask your question out loud. If it can't be heard, Ashley will repeat your question so everyone will be able to hear. So with that, I am going to turn the program over to Kate Scott, Senate historian.
Thank you so much, Sheila, and welcome. I'm delighted to be here with you today. Sheila, I can't thank you enough for inviting me to join you today. This is exactly the kind of thing that I like to do, talk about Senate history to people outside the institution who have an interest in it, who love politics and history as I do. So I'm really feeling very fortunate to be with you today. When we mention women of the Senate, we typically think of female members. But long before women served in the United States Senate, they were leaving their mark on Senate history. And that's really the focus of my talk today, to think expansively about women's many contributions to the Senate as an institution and to the nation as a whole. The Senate has always been more than its elected members. It's really an ever-evolving community of characters. Each and every one of those characters has helped to shape the history of the Senate and therefore the nation. Today, I have the great privilege of sharing a few highlights of that rich and varied story, focusing on a few trailblazing women, some of whose names will be unfamiliar to you, I hope. But I hope that this will give you a better understanding of the important role that women have played throughout Senate history. When the Senate opened its doors to the public in 1795, and particularly when Congress moved to Washington, D.C. in 1800, women became frequent visitors to the Senate chamber. They filled the public galleries, they mingled with senators in the chamber, and they even sat behind those historic desks. Women witnessed the Senate's most important events, and fortunately for historians like myself, they also recorded their observations of those events in letters, diaries, and later in published articles. Margaret Bayard Smith was one of these women. She arrived in Washington in 1801 as the young wife of the founder of Washington's first big newspaper, the National Intelligencer. She was smart and articulate, and she was also a lifelong writer of letters who began writing for publication in the 1820s. Her descriptions of Senate action are particularly noteworthy and useful to someone like me. Her account of the Senate chamber during the historic 1830 debate between Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster and South Carolina's Robert Hayne is one great example. Almost everyone is thronging to the Capitol to hear Mr. Webster's reply, she wrote. The Senate chamber is the present arena, and never were the amphitheaters of Rome more crowded. Every seat, every inch of ground, even the steps were compactly filled. Now, the official records of the Senate from this era give us the basic facts, the sketch, the equivalence of a black and white drawing, but writings like Smith's provide the colors, the shapes, the nuances, and the shadows that give us a more complex understanding of how the Senate was operating in those days. From the earliest days of our national history, of course, women activists have lobbied Congress for their causes, particularly for the abolition of slavery and for the right to vote. Senator Aaron Sargent of California introduced the first bill to amend the Constitution to provide suffrage for women, which he did at his wife Ellen's request in 1878. Women suffragists first testified that year before a Senate committee lobbying for the passage of that bill. But there were very few allies for their cause among the male members at that time. Still, suffragists returned to the Senate again and again to lobby for that cause. Now, it took decades of hard work and sacrifice, but these tenacious women refused to give up. They organized marches, they staged protests, they picketed the Senate office building. This is the Senate office building right behind them in this photo, which opened in 1909. They were really a constant presence in 1917, 1918 as the Senate prepared to vote on this bill a couple of different times. Some male senators dismissed their efforts as nagging. They hated the lobbying effort. But without their tenacity, the bill to provide for women's suffrage might never have made it through the US Senate. The House passed the amendment in 1918, but it twice failed to pass the Senate that same year. Finally, on June 4th, 1919, the Senate approved the amendment after more than 40 years of activism by women and their male allies. The House also approved the amendment, and off it went to the states where ratification was completed in the summer of 1920. Needless to say, without women activists, without women lobbyists who doggedly lobbied members of Congress for more than 4 decades, the 19th Amendment might never have become part of the United States Constitution. Now, early in the 20th century, the Senate benefited from a talented group of pioneering female staff. Their numbers were relatively small at the time, but they forged a path that others followed. Leona Wells was one of these women. She was born in Illinois in 1877, but she moved to Wyoming when she turned 21. Why? Because Wyoming allowed women to cast votes in federal elections. It was part of their state constitution. And there she soon met Senator Francis E. Warren. It was his patronage that brought her to Washington, D.C. In 1901, Leona Wells joined the clerical staff of the Senate Committee on Claims, and she remained on the Senate payroll for the next 25 years. As chair of the Military Affairs Committee, one of the most powerful Senate committees at the time, the precursor of the Armed Services Committee, Warren appointed Wells to lead the committee staff. In 1911, Warren became chairman of Senate Appropriations, one of the most powerful Senate committees as well, and Wells went with him to that committee. At the time, Leona Wells was unusual. She was a well-paid professional woman working on Capitol Hill, and she was unusual enough that she attracted some media attention. Leona Wells is probably the most envied woman in government service, reported the Boston Globe in 1911 in an article entitled Uncle Sam's Highest Salaried Woman. Not only did she earn a good salary, the article noted, but she had been placed in charge of the affairs of a big committee. Wells was a pioneer, but she actually wasn't alone on Senate staff at that time. In the early 20th century, a steadily growing number of women had joined Senate staff, particularly at the committee level. And what we've found by really carefully looking at Senate records from that era is that by 1922, more than 50% of Senate committee staff positions were held by women. And of course, there have been women senators, 60 of them so far. The first came in 1922, Rebecca Felton of Georgia. 87-year-old Felton might seem an unlikely choice to set that milestone, but here's the story behind her appointment. On September 26, 1922, Senator Tom Watson died in office, leaving a vacancy to be filled by gubernatorial appointment until the upcoming special election. Now, the Georgia governor, Thomas Hardwick, wanted to appoint a placeholder to fill the seat temporarily, and then he planned to run for that seat himself and win in the November election. But because he had opposed granting women the right to vote 2 years earlier, he faced a lot of opposition from those newly enfranchised women in the state of Georgia. So what did he do? Well, to overcome their opposition, Hardwick decided to appoint a woman to fill the vacancy and thereby allow her to make history as the first female senator. On October 3rd, 1922, he appointed 87-year-old Rebecca Felton, who was at that time a very prominent voice in Georgia politics. Since the Senate had already adjourned sine die that year, meaning it didn't plan to come back into session, Hardwick's action was seen as purely symbolic, an effort to gain female votes. "I would like to see the old lady go to Washington," the governor stated publicly, but he was fairly certain that she'd never appear on the Senate floor. His scheme backfired, however, because he lost the election in November, and across the nation, women demanded that Felton actually be seated, that she get the opportunity to take the oath of office in the Senate. Hundreds of women descended upon Washington, and hundreds of others sent letters and telegrams demanding that President Warren Harding convene a special congressional session that would allow Rebecca Felton to be sworn in. President Harding resisted for a while, and then on November 9th, he called Congress back into session, claiming that it was for military reasons. When the Senate convened on November 21st, the winner of the November election in Georgia delayed presenting his credentials so that Felton could officially claim the honor of becoming the first woman senator. She took the oath shortly after noon, then served another 24 hours before she relinquished her seat to Walter George, who had been elected in November. A gallery full of women in the Senate chamber erupted into cheers and applause as Senator Felton bade farewell. "The one message I have for women," she said, "is that their era has dawned." What began as one man's ploy to gain a Senate seat ended as a milestone for women in American politics. In 1932, Hattie Caraway was elected to the Senate, another milestone. Caraway began her career as a Senate spouse. Her husband, Thad, was elected to the Senate in 1920, and he died unexpectedly in 1931. When Arkansas Governor Harvey Parnell offered Hattie an appointment to fill her husband's seat and the senatorial salary that came with it, she gratefully accepted the appointment. She also agreed to run in the required special election to fill out the one-year remainder of that Senate term. Hattie Caraway easily won that special election on January 12, 1932, becoming the first woman elected to the United States Senate. But the best part of the story is still to come. Governor Parnell and other leading Democratic Party officials in Arkansas assumed that Caraway would quietly step down when her term ended, but they were wrong. On May 9, 1932, on the very eve of the filing deadline, Caraway declared her candidacy for the full Senate term. "I pitched a coin and heads came up 3 times," she noted in her diary, adding, "I really want to try out my own theory of a woman running for office." People believed at the time that she had very little chance of being elected, but she persevered. She won the election that year and re-election in 1938, and she served in the Senate until 1945. During that time, Hattie Caraway achieved many Senate firsts: the first woman to chair a committee, the first woman to preside over the United States Senate. But her greatest legacy lies in her decision to defy her party's expectations and run and win election to a full Senate term. Now, no talk about trailblazing Senate women would be complete without discussing Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine and her extraordinary career. After serving more than 4 terms in the House of Representatives, Smith was elected to the Senate in 1948, the first woman to be elected to both houses of Congress. For 15 of the 24 years that she served in the United States Senate, she was the only woman serving at that time. Can you imagine what that must have been like? All of the rooms that she entered where she was the only woman. On June 1st, 1950, when she had been in office for barely a year, this junior senator entered the Senate chamber where she planned to make a speech that would be a defining moment in her political career. Only weeks earlier, Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy had rocketed to national attention by claiming to possess the names of 205 card-carrying communists who worked in the State Department. Like many of her colleagues, Smith shared McCarthy's concerns about communist subversion, as many people did in the mid-50s during the Cold War. But she grew skeptical when McCarthy repeatedly refused to give her evidence that would support his accusations. At first, Smith hesitated to speak out. I was a freshman senator, she explained, and in those days, freshman senators were to be seen and not heard. She hoped that a senior member would take the lead against McCarthy, but that didn't happen. This great psychological fear spread to the Senate, she later explained, where a considerable amount of mental paralysis and muteness set in for fear of offending Joe McCarthy. So weeks passed, and Smith grew increasingly unsettled by McCarthy's attacks and accusations. And so she began to prepare a speech to challenge him, but she carefully crafted it so as not to attack him personally, because that would violate Senate rules of decorum. Instead, she chose to denounce the tactics that became known as McCarthyism. In the Senate chamber, she began, "Mr. President, I would like to speak briefly and simply about a serious national condition. The United States Senate has long enjoyed worldwide respect as the greatest deliberative body, but recently that deliberative character has been debased to a forum of hate and character assassination." In her 15-minute address, delivered while Senator Joe McCarthy sat at his desk only a few yards away, Smith endorsed the right to free speech. Those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism in making character assassinations are all too frequently those who, by our own words and acts, ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism: the right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, the right of independent thought. As she concluded her remarks, Smith introduced a statement that she had signed along with 6 of other colleagues. She called it her Declaration of Conscience. Her speech triggered a public explosion for both support and criticism. By one act of political courage, Smith has justified a lifetime in politics, observed one reporter. Newsweek magazine ran a cover story entitled "Senator Smith, a Woman Vice President?" Critics called her a Moscow lover, and much worse. McCarthy dismissed her and her supporters as Snow White and the 6 Dwarves. Smith's Declaration of Conscience did not end McCarthy's reign of terror. That continued for 4 more years. But she was one of the first senators to take such a stand against him, and she continued to oppose McCarthyism at great professional risk. When she ran for re-election in 1954, for example, McCarthy handpicked her opponent in Maine and poured funds into the campaign in order to try to deny her a second term. But she was simply too popular in her home state. She defeated her challenger in that race, and in doing so, she proved to her Senate colleagues that you could oppose Joe McCarthy and still get re-elected. In fact, Smith was reelected in 1960 and 1966, and she served in the Senate until 1973. Women like Margaret Chase Smith and the other activists and observers and staff that I've noted have blazed a trail that many others have followed. By the 1950s, a few other women senators had served for very short appointed terms. In 1961, Oregon Senator Marie Newberger joined Margaret Chase Smith to serve a full term, and they've served concurrently. Nancy Kassenbaum of Kansas was elected in 1978 and remained in the Senate until 1997. Barbara Mikulski joined the Senate in 1987 and served for 30 years. But not until 1992 did more than 2 women serve simultaneously as senators. Yeah, let me say that again. Not until 1992 did more than 2 women serve simultaneously in the United States Senate. Why 1992? Well, here's that story. In the fall of 1991, the Senate was scheduled to take a vote on the nomination of then Judge Clarence Thomas for a seat on the Supreme Court. When law professor Anita Hill's allegations against Thomas became public, Senator Barbara Mikulski, one of only 2 women serving in the Senate, insisted that the Senate postpone its scheduled vote to allow Professor Hill to testify before the all-white, all-male Judiciary Committee. After hearing Hill's testimony, the Senate approved Judge Thomas's nomination to the Supreme Court. In the months that followed, Senator Mikulski advised women to channel their frustrations with the Senate proceedings. Don't get mad, get elected, she counseled. In 1992, a record number of women ran for federal office and won. Journalists called it the Year of the Woman, a phrase that in my mind doesn't quite capture the impact of this historic election on the decades that followed. 4 women won election to the Senate in 1992, including Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer, whose wins made California the first state in the nation to be represented in the Senate by 2 women. Now there have been 4 states. Senator Patty Murray of Washington State was also elected that year. Today, she serves as the Senate's president pro tempore and chairs the powerful Senate Appropriations Committee. And let's not forget the achievements of Carol Moseley Braun, who in 1992 beat an incumbent in the Illinois primary to win the general election and become the first Black woman to serve in the U.S. Senate. In 1993, Judiciary Committee Chairman Joe Biden lobbied Feinstein and Braun to join the Judiciary Committee, making them the first women to serve on that committee since its formation in 1816. The number of women in the Senate has grown steadily since the Year of the Woman. Today, 25 women serve in the Senate, and we've reached 60 women who have served in the Senate in total. But here's the number that's important. That's 60 women compared with the 1,943 men who have served since 1789. Though relatively few in number, these 60 women senators have had a large and lasting impact on the institution of the Senate. They are now setting the stage for decades ahead. A few years ago, my colleagues and I launched the Women of the Senate Oral History Project as a way to commemorate the centennial of the 19th Amendment and to recognize the centennial of Rebecca Felton's historic service. Since 2018, we have conducted interviews with more than 20 individuals, about half of them with retired senators, others with Senate officers, women officers, and high-ranking women staff. These interviews help to document the structural and cultural barriers women encountered in running for office, the reception of their male colleagues when they arrived at the Senate, and how they, so few in number, develop strategies for legislative success. And also, it tells us something about what kind of personal experiences they brought to the place and how that shaped their approaches to crafting national policy. Most of these interviews have been conducted on video. A few have been audio only, and we've made some select interviews available on the Senate website. You can see that page here. You're all welcome, of course, when my talk is through to go in there and take a look at some of those interviews. But today, I want to share with you a sample of voices from that Women of the Senate Oral History collection. This curated video highlights how senators and staff understood their role in the Senate, and it also presents their reflections on how the growing number of women in the Senate have at times subtly and at times directly shaped legislative agendas. Here we go.
When I've talked about the women in the Senate, I said we focus on the macro issues: war, peace, the support of our military, the defense of our borders. But we also focus on the macaroni and cheese issues, the macro issues and the macaroni and cheese issues. What does it mean? What do our policies mean to the American family? And how are their lives going to be better, more improved because of what we do? And that's where we focused again on health care. We focused particularly on as it affects women and therefore the family. And in doing so, improved also research for men as well. It was never girl versus boy. It was never about gender only. It was about an agenda that focused, yes, on make sure the empowerment of women, the strengthening of the American family, and a more inclusive society that moved us forward.
I didn't do women's issues except spousal IRA.
Right.
Things that I had experienced, which is one of the reasons I say it's so important to have women in the process, is because you do bring a different experience to the table. Nobody was against spousal IRAs having an equal opportunity to have retirement options as people who work outside the home. No one was against it, but nobody had had the experience that I had, which was I was single. I started an IRA. I got married. I wasn't working right after I moved to Dallas, and I was told I couldn't put money into the IRA except $500. And I said, this is outrageous. I mean, women are the ones who need that retirement security. So I took that experience and introduced the bill, got Barbara Mikulski to co-sponsor it. When she met with me, she said, it's a great idea. Of course I'll co-sponsor it. I said, look, it's a Democratic Congress. You be the lead sponsor. I'll be the co. It'll be Mikulski, Hutchison. And she said, no way. This is your idea.
Yeah.
And I'm going to support it. And it's going to be Hutchison Mikulski. And then she did the legislation to name it for me. It's the Kay Bailey Hutchison Spousal IRA.
Yeah.
So that was a woman's issue, but you know, it's spousal. And it was just from my experience. But I didn't do women's issues generally. I did what was important for Texas.
More women make it better. And at one point, we finally, at one point, had at least one woman on every committee in the United States Senate. That was a breakthrough. Because if you think about it, for 200 years, that committee met and didn't have one woman that could speak. Not one, unless she was called on, and then she was given a time limit. So when you're building big policy and big bills, it's hard to give your opinion in 30 seconds as a witness, or you can submit 1 minute of testimony. When you're a senator, nobody can turn your mic off, and that makes a big difference. And so once we got one woman on every committee, then you could really start feeling and seeing that change. It was subtle in some instances, very direct in others. Daycare was not, it was a women's issue, but it's an economic issue for the United States of America, like the whole country. The GDP depends on women being able to work. It is not a soft, little, side issue. It is a central economic question for a nation. No one would look at it that way, even when they started talking about it and saying, oh, well, we might consider it. Nobody still really talks about it that way. But we know that. The women know that. And we bring that kind of passion to it.
It absolutely matters. And the reason why is diversity of input. And I think that and I don't mean that as just a gender issue. I think diversity of input from different backgrounds, different races, ethnicity, it's so important to have not just one viewpoint in a room. And it's been so exciting to me to see how many women are now in the Senate at all levels, because I do think that we bring a different set of viewpoints. And we've really started to make it clear too, Republicans and Democrats, that some of these issues that are, quote, women's issues, no, the economy is a women's issue. And I feel like that's known now. It used to be that women's issues are X, Y, and Z. And now it's no, women care about the family budget, they care about jobs, they care about the economy, they care about healthcare, they care about, it's broader than that. And I think having that diversity of input here in the Senate now is really what has helped in that respect.
Even though we will say, every issue is a woman's issue, which of course it is, if you act like you want to talk about taxes or financial matters or foreign policy, they look at like what are you doing here? It's like you've just stepped out of your place again. And so that's a reality that I'm happy to say I believe is beginning to change. I think this new crop, that the young women have kind of broken through a lot of that. I think that may be why so many of them chose to go on the Armed Forces Committee, to begin to break those stereotypes, to say, women can deal with military issues too. And we are here to talk about these matters. And but that had to be, it was a deliberate effort because the stereotypes are so prevalent and ingrained.
Now, just one final thought here. This past year, we lost a Senate trailblazer with Senator Dianne Feinstein's passing. Unfortunately, our office did not have the opportunity to interview Senator Feinstein about her career in public service or the challenges that she faced and overcame as a United States Senator. But I'd like to say a few words in recognition of her remarkable career. You likely know about Senator Feinstein's rise through local California politics, but did you know that Feinstein was an accomplished equestrian in her youth, a rodeo queen, and a warm-up jockey at the racetrack? Most of you are likely familiar with the tragedies that she endured during her political life, losing her several spouses, for example, becoming mayor of San Francisco after the 1978 assassinations of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. Though we missed our opportunity to interview Senator Feinstein, her colleagues, who we did have the opportunity to interview, had plenty to say about the way that Feinstein approached the work. When Senator Blanche Lincoln of Arkansas joined the Senate in 1999, she was the youngest senator at age 39, and she was then the mother of twin toddler boys, When recalling Feinstein's mentorship of new women senators in 1999, Lincoln said that she was a big fan of Senator Feinstein. These are the words of Senator Lincoln. She is just remarkable in her diligence. She knows her issues. She takes home a briefcase at night. She studies them. She doesn't look at things as a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. She looks at things as an issue. What is right about this issue? What is right? What is it that we have to do that is right to move forward? Never did I ask her a question or ask for advice that she didn't give me both sides of. She said to me, "This is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to do, but I want you to know what the other side of the coin is," Senator Lincoln recalled in our interview. Now, I think that quote is really telling because it suggests the kind of pragmatism and approach to lawmaking that made Dianne Feinstein so well suited for service in the Senate, which is an institution whose rules and precedents encourage compromise. If you'd like to know more about women in the Senate, I've really just touched the tip of the iceberg here. You'll find that several online exhibits at senate.gov, including a feature, The Women and the Senate and Women's Fight for the Vote, and our Women of the Senate Oral History Collection can be found there. I want to thank you so much for your time today, and I'd love to turn it over to discuss any questions you might have or feedback.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was absolutely fabulous, really fascinating. And it was wonderful to see these women giants of the Senate again to remind me of what Congress was at one time, these women greats. Yes.
So many of them, really.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Giants in their own time.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's open it up for questions. We don't have anything yet in the chat, but I'm wondering, Ashley, do you have anything there at Lubber Run? Does anyone have a question?
No questions so far. No questions.
Here's a question in the chat now. In addition to the Year of the Woman, what other factors have helped more women to get elected?
That's a great question. These are some of the questions that we asked senators as upon their retirement, as we interviewed them for our oral history collection. And they told us a variety of things. I think one is that societal expectations have changed. So when we ask women, typically when we start off our interviews with women, we'll ask them, what were people's expectations of you growing up? And what kind of female role models did you have? And several of them, for example, Olympia Snow of Maine, noted that one of her female role models was Margaret Chase Smith, who had been that trailblazer in the 1950s and 1960s. Then other members have talked to us about women in their family who encouraged them to think about doing anything that they wanted to do, whatever that looked like, if that was going into politics, if it was becoming a nurse, if it was becoming a teacher, any of those things would have been options for them. Having the support of family and friends who sort of saw their horizons as unlimited. But I think that speaks to sort of the societal expectations. We see more women in these places, and therefore we have more women who are interested in entering the public sphere in that way and thinking that they have a chance that they can do it. Barbara Boxer, for example, just talked about the fact that Barbara Boxer's entrance into politics began with her anti-Vietnam War work. She was personally and deeply opposed to the Vietnam War. And that's how she got interested in politics in California. And she started at the local level and then worked her way up, elected to the House of Representatives, and then moved to the Senate. But it's that desire, that drive to address changes, to address problems that you see around you. And the way to do that is through politics. I think those are some of the factors that contribute to more women entering the arena.
Thank you so much for that very thorough answer. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Oral History Project? That sounds really interesting, and what's involved and how people can access it.
Yes. So the Senate Historical Office was created in 1975, right after the Senate Watergate investigation, in part because the two party leaders wanted to have a place within the institution that could serve as the Senate's memory. What types of actions had the Senate taken in the past? And they needed a place where the experts would be in charge of that institutional memory. So they created the historical office, and then the founding historians of my office, if you will, started an oral history project just the year after the office was created, because they could see around them that there were so many Senate staff who had been in the institution for 30, 40, even 50 years, and that they had a lot of institutional memory themselves. And that if we could get them to record their Senate careers, really, we could get them to tell the stories about how the Senate had changed over time and the ways in which it operated and the rules and the ways in which members interacted with one another, if we could get those recordings, that would help the historical office understand how the institution has changed over time. So the Oral History Project goes all the way back to 1976. More recently, we've done some really targeted interviews like the Women of the Senate Oral History Project, for example, where we're focused on answering a very specific set of questions. And these questions for us were all about understanding sort of the barriers that women encountered when they joined the United States Senate, whether that was as Senate staff or whether that was as elected members, and also the ways in which their camaraderie as women, their unique, like the fact that there were so few of them sort of created a natural bond. And that helped them in a variety of ways to tackle all kinds of challenges that came their way, whether that was the challenge of, hey, there isn't a bathroom for women senators, but there's a bathroom for male senators. they had to confront that reality in 1993, or bigger picture type of things like, gosh, we'd like to make sure that the National Institutes of Health are are researching women's breast cancer and getting the same kind of funding for that type of research as for these other diseases that typically are more prominent in men. So there were ways that they work together. We learned through the oral histories, there were ways that they work together to sort of tackle some of these big problems. You can find, let me back up, Sheila, to answer your question a little bit more directly too. If you go to the Senate.gov website, under the Art and History tab, you can find the Senate's Oral History Project. And the Senate Oral History Project online includes a selection of our oral histories. Most of them are presented in transcript form, so you can read them just like you would read a book. And then we have a few select audio clips and the one video presentation that you saw today.
Okay. Anybody at Lubber Run have a question, Ashley?
Yes, we have one question.
Thank you.
Okay, I was wondering, what percent of the Senate staff is now female?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't have a definitive answer for you. What I can tell you is that through our oral histories, we have people noting in their oral histories that one of the biggest changes in the institution in their time of service, and typically that's for the people who started, let's say, in the 1970s, late 1970s, right up to the present, has been the change in the number of women and their presence in all the rooms. So I interviewed one woman who started her career in the late 1970s working for Senator Carl Levin, and she talked about what it meant to be a woman in the institution at that time and some of the challenges that she faced, and not having access to childcare, for example, or needing to adjust her schedule. The Senate has a very unpredictable schedule, needing to figure out ways to adjust her schedule to make it so that she could be there every night for her kids at dinner time, for example. And then talking about as her career advanced and she retired in the early 2000s, that she noted that that the institution had become more supportive of family needs and more and easier. It was easier for women to recognize that that what had been unique circumstances in the 1970s was becoming something that men and women were grappling with by the early 2000s. So I don't have a number for you, but I can say that there are many, many more. The proportions have changed dramatically in the Senate in the last quarter century.
That's encouraging. Yay. We have another question in the chat. Is there a women's caucus or other group like the Black Caucus for women senators?
That's a great question. And on the Senate side, we tend to not have the same caucus structure that they do on the House side. But what we do have on this side, what's been very interesting and we've been able to document in our oral history collection, is that Senator Barbara Mikulski and Senator Nancy Kassenbaum, and then soon after Kay Bailey Hutchison, they created a women's dinner. And once a month, the women senators will meet for dinner hosted by one of the women senators at their home. And it's a no staff and no leaks kind of event. So senators show up by themselves, they don't bring their staff, and it's kind of an off the record talk. Now, as I've learned as I've been doing these interviews, the women don't necessarily focus on politics and policy. A lot of the talk can just be getting to know one another, talking about their families, the challenges that they have, what their kids are up to. It can be any number of things. A lot of it is just about building relationships and getting to know one another. But what that opportunity has provided for them is to use those relationships to build policy consensus at other times. So they may those bonds of friendship then later become sort of helpful tools as they try to build consensus within the institution for any number of policy proposals that they're putting on the table. It's not quite a woman's caucus, or like the Congressional Black Caucus is. It doesn't have that same structure. It's more informal, but it's been quite resilient. And now I think they're going on, I don't know, 20 years strong that they have that they do these dinners.
Wonderful. I think you have the most fabulous dream job there is. Can you tell us what a typical day as the Senate historian would look like?
Well, I like to tell people that there is no typical day, and that is part of the fun of the job. Because when I come in on any given day, you just never know what you're going to find. You may have something planned for yourself, like you're going to do an oral history interview in the afternoon, for example. But then you'll come in the morning thinking you might have some time to think about that interview and prepare for that interview. And then the national political news cycle overtakes us, and we might be getting a lot of calls about, I don't know, whatever the issue of the moment is. Or if a senator came out and said something dramatic, we might be getting some calls about that. We serve a number of audiences in this office. First of all, I should say that the Senate Historical Office is a staff of 12. I work with 11 fabulous colleagues, some of whom are devoted to helping the senators and the committees archive their records for future generations, and some of whom are devoted to doing the research and the writing that is very much a part of the historical side of the office's mission. So I work with those folks every day, and we serve a number of audiences. The senators, staff, committee staff may be calling us, daily. We'll get calls from different places asking questions about when was the last time the Senate did this, or how has the Senate's thinking about doing this, what's the context for the way that they did that in the 1950s, for example, or in the 1890s, or why did the Senate establish permanent committees in 1816? Those types of questions are the things that we field on a regular basis. But we also get to do this sort of educational outreach, talk to groups like yours. We talk to students, we help them with their History Day projects. We talk to teachers every opportunity that we have. We do talks and tours within the institution, and then for special guests from outside the institution. So every day is slightly different. Tomorrow, I may be giving a tour for a senator and a couple of select guests of historic spaces in the United States Capitol. And next week, I may be preparing to give a talk to one of the committees, which I'm preparing to give a talk next week to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff about the history of that committee. So every day can be a little bit different. And Sheila, I completely agree with you that this is like the funnest job. It really is.
I think it sounds wonderful. I think you're wonderful. I can't thank you enough for coming. Just want to give people one last chance to ask their questions before we sign off. I don't see anything in the chat. Anybody else at Lubber Run have a question, or anybody on Zoom just want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
I have a question. I'm not sure it's a good one, but was there anything specific that you did in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol?
That's an excellent question.
Yes, there were lots of things that we did. one of the things that we did was just begin to collect as much media as we could from that event. So staff who were present in the Capitol at that time shared with us some of the photos that they had taken. We've collected stories of the people who were present in the Capitol or the office buildings on that day. We've tried to document that event as best we can for future generations, to be able to put that particular thing in the context in which it deserves. We also, with each of the presidential impeachment trials, going back to the Bill Clinton impeachment trial in the 1990s, we are an office that is very closely involved in documenting those very specific constitutional responsibilities that belong to the United States Senate.
Okay, that's fascinating. Any other questions? And again, if you're on Zoom, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask out loud. Going once, twice, 3 times. Okay. Thank you so much, Kate. This has been awesome. I have to say, truly wonderful. And I so appreciate your making the time to speak with us. We've learned so much from you and I'm so grateful.
Oh, you're welcome. It was really my pleasure, Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our wonderful participants who've joined us today, both on Zoom from home and at Lubber Run. And thanks again to Ashley for making it possible for us to do this as a hybrid program. Thank you all. Take care. Be well. We'll see you soon.